Well, hello everybody, welcome to your language teaching and learning channel. My name is Santiago, and if you're new to the channel or you haven't watched the first couple of videos we posted when we first opened the channel a few months ago, from the introduction to this video and from the things that you can see around me, you would be safe to assume that I am a Beatle fan. And for us, Beatle fans, December 8, 1980 was a terrible day. And it reminds me of one of my teachers in high school, and I remember, I think I mentioned it to you sometime before, Mr. Bill Naylor. He was teaching us psychology, and it must have been grade 10 or 11 when we were talking about events that mark a person's life on a personal level, and sometimes he mentioned there are events that not only mark one person but also communities or cities or provinces or states or countries or even the world. And he went on to mention John F. Kennedy's assassination. And of course he did mention that probably at the time some of us probably hadn't even been born or were not young enough to know what was going on. He mentioned that we should ask our parents or our grandparents or an aunt, an uncle, a relative, a friend, and they would probably be able to remember specifically where they were and what they were doing when they heard the news. And he said depending on how important it was to them, they might even remember what they were wearing. So December 8, 1980 was when John Lennon was assassinated. And in my case, specifically, I cannot remember what I was wearing, which was probably pajamas anyway, but I do remember specifically what had happened the day before and the day after it happened. I very clearly remember that I had an exam on Tuesday, that was December 9th, and it was a physics exam. I can't really recall if it was a physics and a math exam in university. I'm very sure it was a physics exam. So the day before, December 8th, I had been studying very hard the whole day, and I went to sleep early, around 10 o'clock, and because I wanted to wake up early the next day, around tops 8 o'clock, so that I could continue studying, because my exam was in the afternoon. Unbeknownst to me, obviously, after I fell asleep, John Lennon had been shot, and a few minutes later on, he was pronounced dead. And as I mentioned, the day before I had been studying very hard, and the next day I woke up, and this is what I woke up to.
To recap, John Lennon, age 40, was shot and killed by a lone gunman last night as he returned to his apartment after a recording session in the studio. The man charged with the shooting is 25-year-old Mark Chapman. He had no motive. In fact, only hours earlier he approached.
That's what I woke up to the next day. My first reaction, of course, was, oh my God, I'm still sleeping. I pinched myself, smacked myself, and washed my face. Changed the radio station and listened to other radio stations, and they all were saying the same thing. So I ran to the television, turned on the TV, and it was a fact. John Lennon had been shot the night before. So I got my tape recorder, and this is the cassette I put in there because I wanted to record that, what was going on at that time. And yeah, the news everywhere. The radio station, as I mentioned, and the newspapers, everything. For the next few weeks, the headline in the front page was always something related to John Lennon and John Lennon's death. And in the beginning, the information was kind of fuzzy, confusing, and just like this year with the pandemic, if you remember, and even now, some of the information that we're getting is contradictory and everything else. It was the same back then, and we knew John Lennon had been shot. And as I mentioned, if somebody was there at the time, especially in Toronto, Canada, please, try and to recall I may be wrong, but I seem to remember that one or two of the radio stations, one of them could have been Chum, I don't know if that station still exists, but they had like 1 week special or something like that, or it could have been a month, I really can't remember. And everything had to do with the Beatles music, the Beatles background, the Beatles influence on the music and in society in general. Previous older music like the blues, Elvis and so on, and their influence on the Beatles and so on and so on. That's what was happening at the time. And as I mentioned, as time went by, more information started coming out. The very first day, the first couple of days, it was a lot of psychologists were interviewed, and there was a psychological analysis on his killer, Mr. Mark David Chapman. And it was all very ironic and confusing, and many people from friends of Mr. Chapman had been contacted in Hawaii, and everybody had mentioned the same thing, that Mark David Chapman was actually a fan of the Beatles and an admirer of John Lennon. So some of the psychological profiles mentioned that well, in his case, he was, John Lennon had disappeared from the spotlight, from public life, for a few years. In this time, Mr. Chapman, you know, he was going around parties, playing the guitar, singing Beatles music and John Lennon music. He even bought glasses, and the psychological profile mentioned that he, in his mind, he was thinking that he was John Lennon, because John Lennon had disappeared. Now, when John Lennon came back, because that's what he did in 1980, he came back with a new album and everything else, so it was like, whoa, okay, the world is too small for two John Lennons. Apparently that's what he was thinking, and that's why he shot him. Of course, there have been different versions since then, and I think one of the most accepted ones is, I think he said it, is that he actually didn't agree with some of the things that John Lennon was saying and doing. And as we mentioned before when we talked about the Beatles, John Lennon was always very straightforward and spoke his mind. So apparently some of the things that he did and said did not appeal to Mr. Chapman, and he mentioned that's why he killed him. And well, there are a lot of ironies around this here. And one of them is this, you know, a fan of the Beatles and John Lennon, he shoots him, you know. So that was ironic. More irony is the fact that, as I mentioned, John Lennon had disappeared, and suddenly he comes back with a new LP, and it's a hit. And the LP, which is Double Fantasy with Yoko Ono, that album was actually released a few weeks in the middle of November, a few weeks before he was shot. And of course this brought him back into the spotlight, and he was having radio interviews all over the place, television interviews. He also did an interview for Playboy magazine, an excellent interview if you can have access to it and read it, about what he was actually doing and what his new album was all about. And I would recommend you listen to some of the songs in his new album, like Starting Over. The songs talk about life, okay, and the problems that we have. And he also has a song for Yoko, he has a song for his son, Beautiful Boy. I recommend you to listen to it too. And you know, things that are real. He advises, the advice he gives to his son is, you know, life is what happens to you while you're busy making other plans. Watching the wheels, he says, people think I'm crazy doing what I'm doing. What was he doing? Well, he was an icon, and we will talk about that later on in the next video, but all this brought him back into life, into the public life, and this is apparently what set Mr. Chapman off, and that's why he killed him. And the other ironic thing about this incident is the fact that a few hours earlier, Mr. Chapman had actually approached John Lennon. He had been following him for a couple of days, come back from Hawaii and just, you know, hang around him, which was normal, obviously, a famous person, and in New York, which is where he lived, it was normal for people to, you know, go around famous people, you know, stars and stuff. And in the case of John Lennon, of course, and especially when he came back to life. So the other ironic thing is that Mr. Chapman had approached Mr. John Lennon a few hours earlier with the album and asked him to autograph it. And there's actually a picture, if you look it up, in which John Lennon is autographing the album and Mr. Chapman is right there looking at him. So a few hours before he shot him, that's what he did. That's one of the ironic things. Obviously, as a Beatle fan, like me, I think I was one of the first people to buy that album, because it was, you know, wow, John Lennon is back. And he was actually doing another album already, but unfortunately this is what happened, okay? So if you were there in that time, okay, what were you doing? Do you remember? What were you wearing? What was your reaction when you heard of the news, okay? We'll continue talking about this next week, and you know, put your thumbs up that you like if you like the video, and if you haven't subscribed to that yet, please do so. And I look forward to seeing you next week. Take care.